Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Friday, January 11th today, and I'm doing a mid-month planetary update. So the reason that I decided to do a mid-month planetary update is because we're in the midst of two eclipses this month, and it's a good time to check in and see where the planets are at, see what they're doing, and kind of uh, check in because eclipse season gets really busy. It's a very dynamic time of year. We get eclipses in two sets. Wherever the nodes of the moon are located, you're going to have eclipses pouring in during two times of the year when the sun is going through the sign of the north node and the sign of the south node, basically. So right now, the nodes of the moon have shifted into Cancer and Capricorn, and so we're seeing eclipses coming through during Capricorn season, and then we're going to have eclipses coming through in Cancer season during the summer. Anytime you've got a back-to-back eclipses, sometimes three, even four of them in a row, it's oftentimes even the simplest transits will be a little bit more powerful because the eclipses are creating kind of, I like to consider it like, I'm not a surfer at all, but I have gone surfing a few times and learned a little bit about it. And one of the things that I learned about surfing is that, these waves come in sets. Some of you may know this. Well, they come in sets. And our normal rhythm of life by the moon every month is a bit like the tides coming in and out. There's a natural ebb and flow that occurs. But certain moon cycles will bring in sets of powerful waves, you could say. And eclipses are like that. They are like super new moons, super full moons. And, by this point, I think probably a lot of people are exhausted from words like super moon. And every time I get, there's a full moon or a new moon or an eclipse or something, I look on social media and there's just the adjective list, like the super blood werewolf moon of the crimson tide of October. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's the same thing if you turn on the Weather Channel. Nowadays, every storm, there's like a rainstorm that's going to last for like 2 hours, but it's being called, like Zeus or something like that. So there is a tendency for, to go overboard with these things. But I really do think that eclipse season is busy and dynamic, and eclipses seem to amplify the power of mundane transits surrounding them. So that's why it's a good time to check in right now, especially because today is always a good day to mark on your calendars for getting things done or for seeing nice developments take place. Is the day of the opening sextile of a lunar cycle. That is when the moon separates from the sun after a new moon and creates its first sextile after separating from the conjunction. So today, for example, as we're talking, the moon is just moving through a sextile with the sun from Pisces to Capricorn. This early sextile in the lunar cycle is talked about by a lot of astrologers as an early time of gathering together resources or of energies starting to kind of coalesce. Sorry to be vague, but you could think about it like this. In the ebb and flow of every month, there's always going to be a period of time toward the beginning of the month where the early development of the lunar movement for the month is gathering steam. It's picking up steam and it's gaining momentum. And developments happen rapidly and more smoothly under the sextile. They pick up a lot under the trine before the full moon as well. And but between the sextile of the opening sextile of the moon cycle and the trine that comes before the full moon, there's also a first quarter. And that first quarter between those two kind of harmonious moments usually represents a little bit more of a dynamic point of tension in the opening half of the lunar cycle. So you have these three distinct parts of the lunar cycle, and all of them are worth paying attention to. But the opening sextile is nice in terms of feeling like you're kind of getting your feet beneath you. And this is a big deal because a lunar eclipse, or excuse me, a solar eclipse that just happened at the beginning of the lunar cycle suggests not just any beginning to this moon cycle, but one that is deeply wed to Saturn. Saturn's in the same sign. It's deeply wed to Pluto. Pluto's in the same sign. We've got Mercury moving through Capricorn right now, the sun moving through Capricorn. But it's also, so it makes it for a very powerful form of new beginning. And I've talked at length already about that. So if you want to go back and look at the new moon eclipse video that I did, called, I think I called it Beauty and the Intolerable. And I also did a full series on the nodes of the moon, so I won't say as much about that now. But after a new moon like that, when the moon moves into its first sextile, it's like, okay, things are really starting to develop now. So you should be feeling like you're able to take some positive first steps towards new goals, or if there's a new chapter that where you're trying to implement something new, it's a good time to just sort of notice and feel the space and continuity and resources and sort of harmonizing of Venus, which is the planet that's associated with sextiles, coming in to help things along right now. So that's a basic thing, like where we stand in the lunar cycle at the moment. Mercury has just separated from a square to Mars. So for the past, 5 days or so, 5-6 days, we've been going through a little window of a Mercury-Mars square. Now, Mercury-Mars is great for analyzing things, breaking things apart. It's associated with math and science, deconstruction, rational analysis. But of course, Mercury-Mars can also be about verbal abuse, or it can be about agitated mind or speech. It can be about the temptation to try to force your point on other people. There's a fine line between trying to tell the truth and make a point and help someone, like a teacher or a coach or something like that may need to address weak points, or an analyst, a systems analyst, may need to look into a system and say, this is where it's weak, and this is what could be improved. But it's also, there are 1,000,001 excuses that people make for being sharp-tongued and critical by nature, and that tend to fall under this. They kind of will say the excuse that we use most often is, the truth hurts. The truth hurts, and the truth is supposed to awaken you. So you should just accept and get used to the idea that the truth is going to hurt. And that attitude is often especially taken by people who have a pattern of being hard on themselves or hard on others, or of being almost relentlessly singular in the way that they think. And that does not usually win hearts and minds to a viewpoint. Being relentlessly singular about the way that we think, when it comes across in a manner that's pushy, or that it comes across too critical or something like that, it's not the right way of being focused. So a lot of the times, the Mercury-Mars square will expose within ourselves or within others or within a relationship, it will expose a kind of fundamentalism of thinking. And so that's been kind of in the air recently. We've been kind of dealing with that. But there's also been true feedback, true analysis, true critical breakdown. So again, it's kind of a double-edged sword, Mercury and Mars, and try to separate the what's helpful and what's not. Especially you can hear it by tone. If someone offers criticism or analysis in a way that is also encouraging, that sees the best in us and sees the potential for growth or change, then that's a good thing. There's a great example of Mercury Mars in the news lately. So there was a weatherman and apparently this weatherman slipped while on air and made a racial slur in his language, and then afterward was fired very quickly, I believe. And then the question became, was the racial slur an accident, like a honest to God slip of the tongue, where he said Martin Luther King Jr. Park. He was a weatherman who was talking about this, and the word King, he slipped and said the word coon, which is of course a horrible racist word to use if you're using it intentionally. But he was saying afterward this was not intentional at all. This came out not at all on purpose. So then the debate shifted to, well, was that kind of a Freudian slip? Did it reveal some inner racist within him, or was this an honest mistake? And it was, this is actually news this week, if you can believe this. So, I mean, it sounds like a trivial story, but it made huge headlines because the guy was fired and there was all this public, what do you call it? Public backlash. The mayor, I think, in his town had called for him to be fired or something like that. And then he's been on air. I think he went on CNN, and he's been on. He went on, made a live cast or something, pleading, saying basically like this was an honest slip of the tongue. So the moment that we live in is very Mercury Mars, in the sense that we've reached a threshold of being really fed up with hate speech, which is probably good, right? It's good to have reached intolerance for hateful speech. But on the other hand, it's the kind of thing where if, let's say, and I don't claim to know the psyche of this man or whether he did or didn't say it intentionally, but let's suppose that this man made an honest slip on the air and said that. It brings up a really interesting question, because then we have to immediately think to ourselves, actually, the more critical, intense, and hateful actions were perhaps the persecuting of a man who made an honest mistake. And that sort of flips the dynamic on its head, and it talks about a potential to be a little too trigger happy around politically sensitive things right now. So that's the same kind of dilemma that we're talking about when we talk about the truth and speaking the truth in love, criticism that's just, and when something is just, but we use it as a platform for anger and vitriol. So we can have the correct perspective on something, but we can still use the truth. We can try to weaponize the truth. Similarly, a slip of the tongue could actually reveal a deeper judgment. I mean, we know this from our own lives by this point, especially if you're interested in things like depth psychology and astrology and so forth. We should know that oftentimes the slips of the tongue that we make reveal something unconscious within ourselves. And sometimes collectively, a slip of the tongue can embroil us in a collective archetype that's unfolding. So I found the whole story very interesting just in perusing the headlines this week, which I do, and especially to see what's going on with the astrology. So I found this to be an incredibly potent example of the Mercury-Mars square. Here is a racist slur that's used on air, but then there becomes this whole debate about whether it's intentional or not, whether it was an accident or not, an honest slip of the tongue, or whether it is revealing something from the depths of the psyche, or whether it was intentional, and then whether the backlash and persecution of the man, if it wasn't intentional, was actually worse. That whole dynamic is really, it's a unique media phenomenon as well. And we have to remember Mercury is, of course, related to everything that's digital and about information and headline and news and gossip and rumors and communication. And so when Mercury goes square to Mars, there's always usually controversial issues that come up around speech and around communication and language and things like that. So that's been in the air right now. It's sort of separating. So there's been lessons that we've been learning around these things. The analysis it's such, remember this thing is that the analysis can be true. Like, I could see that my daughter is doing something that's wrong, but the way in which we handle that is, basically, if I don't handle something that my daughter does that's really wrong, incorrect, like if I don't handle it well, then she's not going to actually learn how to correct that, right? So if I like just totally assault her because she's done something wrong, that doesn't teach her anything. And then I've weaponized the truth. This is a Mercury-Mars dynamics very present in the sky right now. The other thing that's going on is now Mercury is moving into a conjunction with Saturn. So the Mercury's conjunction with Saturn is also going to be about economy. You're going to see people start saying things like say less, speak fewer words, economy, kind of. Mercury Mars is very analytical, more aggressive, and then Mercury comes into Saturn and says, okay, now it's time to shut up. Now it's about economy of words. Now it's about saying fewer things. So as astrologers, one of the benefits that we have of studying astrology is that even if we get caught up in these unfolding dynamics, we know very well what's going on, right? So, for example, let's say that in your relationship with someone, you go through a phase of being very analytical and sort of harsh toward one another. And then suddenly you start taking up a stance of silence and giving each other the cold shoulder. If you know the astrology and you say, oh, you know what, we were like bashing each other back and forth, now we're giving each other the silent treatment. Mercury just went from a square to Mars to a conjunction with Saturn. You're like, okay, well, there's this dynamic is, in a sense, we've been possessed by. That's what ancient astrologers really wanted us to see, is that in this world of constantly fluctuating dualities, arguments that we have, the movements that we get caught up in every month, all of these things that we go through, we often think that this is exactly it. This is what's happening. This is the most important thing. Astrology gives us a perspective that's like, yeah, it's actually just a passing Mercury-Mars square followed by a Mercury-Saturn conjunction. So, these dynamics in the next couple of days with Mercury going into a conjunction with Saturn might be more about finalizing things or terminating things or agreeing to things in a more resolved and tight manner. You can think of contractual obligations, Mercury, Saturn. You can think of tightness of the mouth. You can think of things that have to do with reformed or refined speech or thought. You can think you may see people starting to speak about austerity of the mind a little bit more strongly. And we have to ask, in a sense, how austere is it really if someone can't help but to get caught up in the astrological transits of the moment and start constantly talking about, so in other words, like, okay, let's say, let me give a simple example. Let's say that you're in a relationship with someone, use that example again, and someone starts saying that they start suggesting that your communication style needs to change, right? And they start hammering in that, we don't have to talk everything to death. We don't have to talk everything to death. Okay. And you see this as Mercury is conjoining with Saturn, right? There's an irony to someone who would continually repeat, we don't have to talk everything to death. We could talk less. There's an irony to someone saying that as they are being possessed by a planet, essentially, that is making them a mouthpiece of a particular idea. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's always important to pay attention to the planetary. The planetary movements help us to know the difference between a true idea, and an idea that is seizing us, that we're becoming a part of its agenda rather than participating with it in a more conscious manner. And I find that oftentimes people who are very critical of astrology, also in the moments when they are very critical of astrology, are oftentimes glowing examples of a current moving transit. So I say this because recently I had someone literally tell me that there should be astrologers should be talking less about the planetary dynamics. Like astrologers shouldn't talk as much about the planetary dynamics because you guys are always just talking about the planetary dynamics. Like astrologers need to talk less. And I was like, all I had to do was pull up the clock on my computer and go, oh yeah, Mercury's about 2.5, 3 degrees from a conjunction with Saturn. This is last night I got this email from someone, not so much directed at me, but just complaining in general that aren't astrologers promoting busyness of the mind? Aren't astrologers promoting too much activity in the mind by talking about everything that's happening all the time? Like, wouldn't it be more meditative if astrologers just sort of shut up? But no, the answer is no, because astrology is not a practice that's here it's not a practice that favors silence over talking or talking over silence. It's not a practice that is trying to get us out of human life. It's a practice that's teaching us how to move through human life and how to notice when different kinds of archetypal themes are coming through. Because when we don't know that they're coming through, we tend to get really jerked around by them in ways that are much worse than if we know something about them. So similarly, a lot of the times what will appear like an incredible insight on our part is oftentimes like truly more of a planetary insight. So you'll come up with something and you'll say, okay, like this or this is, in a business meeting or something, you'll come up with a great idea about how to improve, there'll be a strategy or something like that. And then we think, how great am I that I came up with that? But these are things that are moving through us, just like, the weather and the wind and all sorts of things move through us. And a lot of the times what we think is ours or what we think belongs to us, what we claim as our own great idea or great thought, is also something that if you know a little bit about the astrology, you'll see it's something that's just moving right through. So I'm spending a little bit of time on this today because there's a very strong Mercury dynamic right now with Mercury square Mars and then Mercury moving into the conjunction with Saturn. And it's a great way of spending time looking at, it's a great time to look at how the developments in mind, speech, communication, patterns, and relationships, the things that occupy our mind, the things that we come up with or whatever, are reflected in the planets. That brings a much deeper kind of meditation into our lives when we become aware of those things. Hope that makes some sense. All right, so Sun's just separating from a conjunction to Pluto. This was, again, very powerful dynamic that came through yesterday. The Sun-Pluto dynamic I also wrote about and made a short video about, so you can go back and check that out on my YouTube channel. But the short of it is that when the Sun conjoins Pluto, there's an opportunity for powerful awakening, revelation, insight, expanded awareness, usually through purging, through things that are coming up from the depths that have a way of exploding whether we like it or not. I had to pull myself away from, two very, potentially embroiling situations yesterday. And only after I pulled myself away from both of them and sort of went downstairs into the kitchen where my wife was just getting back from work, making dinner, and the kids were there and whatever. And we were starting to talk about something. And even though I had tried to pull myself out of two things up in my office here that I were like, okay, this is Sun Pluto, like I'm totally getting pulled in. So I went downstairs and then got into an argument. It was fairly harmless, but got into an argument with my wife. So it's sometimes it's also sort of impossible to miss these transits, to not be just sucked in and pulled into them. It's very, very difficult. They the Sun Pluto transit is also about something that comes to it can be a very strong, powerful force that kind of comes and wants to co-opt our consciousness and our way of seeing things and our way of being in the world. And the Pluto Sun dynamic is often about that which overpowers. And something that overpowers can be instructive. It can guide us. It can heal us. There can be releasing of kind of poisonous thoughts or unconscious patterns or behaviors that kind of just come up. Similar, like the news anchor, in some ways, whether he meant it or not, just the surfacing of that word in the midst of his broadcast was a powerful example of Sun Pluto, where you're just co-opted by a force or a power. It could be collective in nature. It might not even be that personal. So like last night, it was kind of like, okay, I have to take myself out of these situations because I feel that the force, the power of just being, sort of being taken over. And then we, so you try to step out, you try to calm down, not get involved, the astrology, but it comes through anyway. It ended up coming through in like a pretty stupid debate that my wife and I got into in the kitchen. So, and then, after we were done and kind of like both of us had like sort of reflected on the situation, I was like, gosh, it was so Sun Pluto, wasn't it? So at any rate, the stuff that comes surging up from the unconscious, the stuff that wants to possess, take hold, empower or bully or dominate, any range of possibilities there. But that stuff is still passing through today. Sun's still pretty close to Pluto, so you may still feel it coming up pretty strongly. There's also the question of one really important question that I was reflecting on again last night with Sun Pluto is what in our lives what tends to be the pattern or the activity that we become possessed by? What tends to seize us or what tends to grab us? And really looking carefully at that, because a lot of times there'll be instructions there for us, like be careful about spending too much of your time here or there, or like if maybe it's like, okay, you belong to a forum discussion of some time, and every time you go into that forum discussion, the topics just have a way of taking over, and then you get really agitated by them, and you're before you know it, you're down a rabbit hole and you've been seized, you've been grabbed, and then suddenly you feel as though you've lost your sense of clarity, your sense of being an individual. It's a very Sun Pluto kind of moment. On the other hand, sometimes there's this feeling of being a conduit for something. Something's coming up and you need to speak or be a conduit. Sometimes, for example, you're having a conversation with a friend or maybe with a parent or something like that, and if it's a Sun Pluto dynamic, you may feel suddenly inclined to just start telling the truth, and before you know it, it's just kind of pouring out. Then there's this fine line when you're in the throes of a Sun Pluto moment where you can, as the power is kind of surging through you, you can start to feel good about it. You can start to feel like this is my power. And that can intensify the dynamic, and that's when it kind of becomes the darker evil king motif, or the dark ego, the powerful, coercive, heavy-handedness of Pluto Sun. So to be very careful right now that the ego is feeling like, it's all strong and mighty about something. It'll just, because it's very easy to be taken over. Of course, the simplest way of not being taken over, in my opinion, is to have a spiritual practice where we try to absorb ourselves in a loving relationship with the divine, which keeps us centered. And I made a video over the holidays for my Kickstarter called How to Start a Spiritual Practice, and also another one called The Spiritual Purpose of Astrology. Those are both for sale right now, by the way. Excuse me, if you'd like a copy. But the gist of both of those videos is that astrology works to tell you, it gives you the lay of the land. It tells you where things are going. But to really work through the everyday transits of life, so to speak, you really have to have a practice of some kind that can help you to stay centered in the heart. So I frankly feel that very few people are naturally equipped to stay equipoised through all of the fluctuations that the planets signify or reflect. So it seems to me more natural to have to cultivate the ability to do so. At any rate, so in terms of the Sun-Pluto dynamic, it's separating, and now the Sun is moving into a square with Uranus in the next week. So we're going, out of the frying pan and into the fire. There's as the Sun-Pluto comes through, the other thing that happens is a transformation of understanding, a transformation of awareness, or a transformation of consciousness. Realizing there's maybe a little bit of an ego death that has to happen, and that can be very healthy. But then the Sun is going straight into a square with Uranus. So again, a power dynamic that's going to be at play in the next week. This one has more to do with innovation, awakening, excitement, enthusiasm, rousing the spirit, but also it's about defiance and defying the status quo, or defying tradition. The need to start fresh that was indicated by the recent solar eclipse is a complicated new beginning. It's made complicated by the heaviness of Saturn. I said this again in the eclipse video, but Saturn's new beginning is one that often involves elimination. So, for example, right now there is a popular Netflix documentary called I think it's called The Magic of Tidying, but it's about this Japanese woman named Marie Kondo, and Marie Kondo, maybe that's how you say it. She is like a tidying expert, but she has a very mindful, sort of Zen way of doing it. Sorry to use a cliche, but she goes into a home. She kind of gets to know the home and honors the home, and then helps people to basically purge their houses and eliminate clutter, and then to organize in ways that are mindful, and to do so in a way that helps you know the difference between having things that spark joy and having things that are just stuff. So she's very good at that, and the show, I think, is becoming something of a sensation. I mean, I've seen a lot of people talking about it, so I think it's becoming kind of popular. The interesting thing is that before I knew that this was a show that was coming on, a year ago, my wife had, at the new year of 2018, my wife had done like a 40-day organizational challenge, an organization and tidying challenge, just on her own, because she struggles, being a mom and a yoga studio business owner and a teacher and everything else. I mean, both of us struggle. I tend to be pretty kind of neat freak tidy, but my wife is pretty much the opposite. So she had started an organizational challenge last year for like 40 days and ended up being very difficult for her to complete it. And so she talked all year about like wanting to try that again, and actually wanting to hire someone to help her, like an organizational coach or something, someone who could come in and help her kind of with some organizing and tidying strategies. So I was looking into getting a consult with someone for her for Christmas. And I found this woman who said she was a graduate of this program in tidying from this woman, Marie Kondo. So I was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. So then I looked this woman up and found out she had a Netflix documentary coming out in January. And then I talked to this woman who's I ended up hiring for my wife as a Christmas present to come out and do a consult with her. And she said, oh, you got to check this Netflix documentary that's coming out, in the new year. And she walked me through the philosophy of the tidying process. And as I was looking at all this, I looked and I said, well, this makes total sense that we're moving into a new year in which there's going to be immediately there's going to be a new moon solar eclipse. Oh, there are always new moons, but a solar eclipse in Capricorn, very Saturnine, very south node, which is all about elimination. But it's about elimination that is a part of a greater vision that's truly about joyfulness. So this is part of what we have in the sky right now, because this newness that's happening is taking place as Jupiter is coming into a square with Neptune, which I also have talked about already and said this is a transit that is really all about the dream, the vision, what's next, and a plan for life that we would like to put into action. And it's a broadening, kind of expansive, faithful, optimistic new way of doing things. It has the feeling of a renewal of faith, right? But with the simultaneous emphasis on all the Saturn and the Pluto and the, it's okay, well, elimination. It's about eliminating, refining, reducing in order to get the vision off and running. Okay, so if you take all of that into consideration and think about the elimination for the sake of sparking joy, the elimination or reduction for the sake of sort of tidying up, cleaning the space and starting from a fresh foundation, a new vision that's coming in, but also the need for a hard bottom line that goes with it. Now, all of that in context, that's kind of where we're at. The sun separates from Pluto. There's this deep kind of cathartic moment. Like last night, even though this debate that I had with my wife was really stupid, it really wasn't even about anything that was that important. What it revealed to me personally was so valuable, because it really showed me a shadow element within myself. I think that's what we're supposed to do after you get into any kind of debacle with someone, whether it's at work or a kid or whatever. We're supposed to, it's the Sun Pluto dynamic. Like, look inward. Whatever just came up, what did it show you about yourself or about the world? So just like we can look at the news anchor, right? And as a collective looking at that event from the astrological perspective, we say, whether he meant it or not, isn't it interesting? Look at the thing from 20,000 feet, and look at the entire dynamic as a whole, and allow that dynamic to enlighten you, allow the entire complexities of the story and the way it unfolded to enlighten you. That's really what that's really what Sun Pluto is about. Yes, stuff comes up, and yeah, it's difficult. You can get overwhelmed, but how does it give you a totally new set of eyes, right? The sun, of course, said to be the organ of perception of the soul. So it gives you a totally new vision. And then now the sun over the next week going into a square with Uranus. Now it's about implementing that, but needing to be innovative, implementing that against resistance, implementing that even if there is some degree of defiance or opposition that comes along with it. So it's a complicated moment. The Jupiter-Neptune is giving us a lot of joy and hope and enthusiasm beneath everything, a sense of expanded possibilities. But in order to get there, it's really having to, kind of chop wood and carry water. There's a working through layers of resistance, a lot of which we set up for ourselves, the way that our lives are naturally arranged. When it comes time to make a shift, or when it comes time to make a change, it doesn't happen instantly. We go through layers of resistance that are set up because of the way we've lived our lives, and because of the way we've set things up around us. And so, working through that in the next week, getting innovative. Don't be surprised if there are disruptions. If at times you feel like you're sort of plugged in and amped up about things, that's very Sun Uranus. Be very careful about being too forceful, too quick, too reckless or impulsive in trying to implement changes. The temptation right now is for the bottom line and the urgency and the sense of the need to start fresh and eliminate, or like that sort of Saturn-Mars dynamic that's perfecting all month, by the way. Saturn in Capricorn, Mars in Aries, it has a pressure cooker kind of feeling to it. But if that becomes the guiding voice or vision, it won't work, because it will overwhelm the Jupiter-Neptune dynamic. So it's kind of it's a light touch. It's sort of like saying, we're going to, like, let's say that you're well, this is a good example. I've got tons of good examples from parenting lately. So let's say that my daughter has built an elaborate fort, right? But let's say that it's this fort, like an elaborate pillow fort. There's some piece of it that has to be removed because you need it for something else, right? If I go in and just take it really quickly and abruptly, it's going to ruin my daughter's fort, and then that's going to ruin my daughter. You know what I mean? Like, she's just going to fall. She's going to get really pissed off. And that's like, then the whole thing is going to go down. So if I know that I need something from that fort, I have to take it. Maybe there's a way of very carefully sort of, swapping out a different object so that this fort doesn't fall apart. And then I have what I need and whatever. So in that sense, I'm trying to keep intact the integrity of something beautiful, something imaginative, something sweet. I'm trying to keep the vibration up, even though I have to do something that's a little surgical, it's a little bottom line, like she's taken the pot and incorporated into the roof of her fort, and I need the pot to cook dinner, and that's the bottom line. We've only got 30 minutes to make this thing happen. So there's a sense of urgency. I have to do something. I have to eliminate something. I have to take something. It could upset somebody. It could be difficult. That's the pressure cooker of the moment. But I also have to make sure that I do this in a way that maintains the expansiveness, the peace, the optimism, the hope, right? So it's a tricky moment like that where we have to figure out how to do both. We can easily stifle ourselves or other people when we offer the hard bottom line right now that doesn't build into it the uplifting quality. That's almost always true, by the way. It can, but when you blend the hard qualities of Jupiter, Neptune with Saturn, Mars, and Saturn, Pluto, and all this, it's like, how do you, here's another one. Let's say that you're doing rehabilitation work on an ancient painting, right? The painting is going to die and fall apart and be gone forever unless you do some important rehabbing work that has to be done. However, if you don't do it very carefully, with care for the spirit of what you're trying to preserve in mind, you could also ruin the artwork. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's an interesting kind of moment where the integrity of a vision, a dream, a hope, something that's delicate and even a little and fragile, even though it might feel vast and big, visions in their early stages are fragile. So how do we be encouraging, enthusiastic, helpful, uplifting, and these kinds of things, while also realizing like there's a problem and it has to be addressed now? That's the dynamic that's unfolding. And in the week ahead, especially with Sun square Uranus, you're going to be feeling the need to, you're going to be hitting the part where there's innovation, revolution, disruption, the need to push forward and shift things radically. Like it's a big surge of good yang energy coming through this week with a dose of Saturnine practicality to it as well. So that's nice, right? Everyone be feeling pretty charged about that. But it could also be the thing that ruins the fort. You know what I mean? So you have to be careful and hold the vision right now as well. It is possible to be encouraging and critical and hardworking, and these things can coexist. I think that's the message of the moment. So it's sometimes harder for those things to coexist, often because we don't want to admit that we need to learn more in order to do so, or we need to reach outside of what is familiar to us or what is known to us in order to do so. But often, all we have to do is open ourselves up with a little bit of humility to that which we don't know or that which is beyond our frame of reference, and be open to learning, be open to other people's expertise and guidance. And a moment like this can also be very, very successful, even if the situation is very dire or critical. So, for example, if you're working with other people right now and you're in a high stress situation of some kind, and there's a deadline or something has to get done or whatever, it's also a good time to really trust one another, that not just one person has to be domineering or controlling it for the results to happen, even if it's under a deadline, to trust and open ourselves up to the expertise or help of others. So Saturn and Mars, I already mentioned, perfecting their square. And then we get into one last dynamic that's really kind of interesting, and I think this is very positive, is that the Venus is also perfecting a trine to Mars. So Venus's trine to Mars is it's going to take a while because they're both moving along right now, but it basically perfects around the 18th, 19th, 20th of the month. So another week or so. But as that's happening over the next month, Venus and Mars in a trine in a fire sign. That's nice. Trines are of the nature of Jupiter, so you're thinking about benefits, blessing, accord, building bigger wholes. And then you're thinking about Venus and Mars getting together, the sort of quintessential yin and yang. Both in fire signs, you're thinking of a meeting of the wills. These two planets are very individual when they're in fire signs. Mars, very strong right now, very disciplined with its square to Saturn. But Venus pouring in the trine from Sagittarius is essentially saying, like-minded people can help one another right now. Or you can say a meeting of friends and allies and colleagues is likely to occur, where there's a plan, there's a pressure, there's a need, there's a difficulty, but you can find allies to help you. Similarly, in relationships right now, your wills and your ways may be very different, but they can get onto the same page with somebody else that you love, because my will can serve your will, my agenda can serve your agenda. There's just more ability to work through things together right now. So that's the Venus-Mars dynamic that's perfecting in the next week. At the same time, again, that Jupiter and Neptune are getting together. And then later in the month, you're going to have Venus is going to get into a conjunction, a square with Neptune, and then conjunction with Jupiter. So I want to say is that it's such a mixed month, isn't it? There's so much support and expansiveness and allegiance and kind of good mojo flowing through, but it's an intense, high pressure situation. There's things that have to be eliminated. There's bottom lines that have to be realized. There's timelines. There's it's got that around it. Now, as if that's not enough, every month it's like this, as if that's not enough. Then you get into the lunar eclipse on the full moon. And that's the last lunar eclipse that's taking place in the sign of Leo. So there's an eclipsing of ego that's also a very important part of this month. I've been thinking of the lunar eclipses more and more and looking at each of them in how they've affected my clients and myself and my family members. And the lunar eclipse in Leo is recognition of the ego's mortality. I think it's a very good way of thinking about it, because this is the moon in the sign of the sun. When the moon is in the sign of the sun, there's an ability to have almost like a servant to the king, a servant to the queen kind of feeling, and ability to have an ego that's very strong, but to also have ability to reflect upon one's own ego with greater grace and ease than normal. And I think that this lunar eclipse is also a signaling of the death of a certain element of our ego. There's a very deep lesson for us this month about where we are over endeavoring, or where we are trying to be more than we should or need to be, and some deeper letting go of the old story of the ego, and then a new, again, I think a new vision for what's possible. Maybe it's a little bit more collaborative in nature, and while it may dim our personal sense of ego a little bit, it may also join us with others in things that we care about even more deeply, and conjoin us to things, bring us into new projects, new groups, new relationships, new visions that we can give more of our true self to as well. So those are my, sort of subjective impressions of some of the astrological energies of the rest of the month. That's what I've got for you today. I hope that this was interesting, and I am looking up through the list to see if there's any questions now. Let's see. Seeing. Does the house have any influence? Yeah, you can take any of these transits and, of course, plug them into your birth chart. Yeah, totally. I won't be going. I mean, when you're doing mundane forecasting, it usually you're not looking at houses. You're just looking at the interactions of planets and talking about the archetypal combinations of the planets just in a general way. But you can certainly plug them into houses. Good advice, Adam. I am taking on a repair project with my teeth through diet and mindfulness. Have to pace myself and hold to the vision. It's a long-term project. Cool. Yeah, that's the very Saturn bottom line, things with teeth and a repair project. And but yeah, it has to be through mindfulness. So there's the way that you're holding it also has to be light. Sherilyn says, attempting to address underlying expectation to be disappointed. Yeah. Yeah, I think the other thing that's important right now is just psychologically is the juxtaposition between the sort of bottom line heaviness of Saturn, which is often about disappointment or the word no or negation, and Jupiter Neptune, which is often about the word yes. So, it's a bit confusing when those two things are in the sky together at the same time. It's like everything's either in Jupiter's sign or Saturn's sign for the most part right now, except for Mars. So yeah, there's the push-pull dynamic of Jupiter and Saturn. How do you forecast this planetary influence on the current government situation? Well, it's interesting. You have a very, in a sense, very progressive Congress with a very progressive vision that a lot of people are very excited about, while you also have a kind of lockdown and gridlock in Washington with the closing of the government. And you have a very dire situation in terms of where the presidency is at and where it's probably headed. And then you have the kind of exciting promise of an overhaul. If you saw the new legislation that the Democrats were proposing, basically, on day one, it's not going to get passed, but it was filled with a lot of sweeping, very broad-minded, exciting changes with regard to voting rights of people and all sorts of stuff. So I found that was, I mean, regardless of your politics, there's definitely a surge of this kind of imaginative, forward-thinking, new wave of women in Congress, a lot of stuff like that. While there's also this kind of, heavy stalemate and power moves and things like that. So obviously, those things you could see these energies as also sort of battling each other right now a little bit, and yeah, I mean, it's your front row as an astrologer. You have kind of a front row seat. You as we're watching this stuff unfold, unless of course you're in the actual, you're an activist or you're in politics or something like that. A lot of us are kind of watching this unfold. Although of course, a lot of people I know here, I live in DC, and a lot of people here are furloughed or not getting their pay. Or it's like a lot of different dynamics that are happening very close to home for me and people in our community here. And it's very real for them right now. But for those of us who are just kind of watching it on the news from afar, it's helpful to have the astrological dynamics at play. And I've already seen clients who have been dealing with the uncertainty of of pay. It's been especially interesting to see how many different ways in which the difficulties related to not having a job are reflected in different birth charts too. So it's not just one way of showing up. The other thing that's very interesting, someone asked me this the other day. They said, do you think when things are difficult like this that astrologers are affected? For example, if there's a recession, will astrologers be affected? And I said, I think when things are difficult, that oftentimes that's when astrologers do the most client work. So astrologers have a weird way of being in demand when things are difficult. So I think that's it's not really what you were asking, but just as an aside, I have been so busy ever since probably the past couple of months as the nodes have changed signs, and as Uranus has dipped back into Aries and stuff like that. Of course, Uranus just turned direct recently as well, and it's barely moving at all right now. So there's also that feeling of the, remember that people love to paint Uranus as this great sort of heroic planet. It's also can be just a terribly malefic planet. We have to remember that all planets have that sort of duality built in, and because they can signify lots of different things. So the unwillingness to compromise within a radical position. I'm going to build a 4th century wall, right? A lot of us are like, oh, that must be Saturn, Pluto, but it's also Uranus not moving. It's also anything that is both radical and entrenched and unwilling to move. Well, like, people might have different perspectives of what that means, but Uranus just sitting there not moving and just starting to move forward again. I think it's going to probably take, I mean, I would guess that the Sun-Uranus square in the next week might light something up. I was surprised that the president didn't declare the emergency power or whatever with Sun-Pluto, but that could still happen with Sun square Uranus. The Sun is essentially kind of bringing the Pluto to the Uranus. But I think when things are really going to shift is in February. In the month of February, Uranus will be going through the last anaretic degree of Aries, the quote-unquote killing degree. And it's a very intense degree. And the last time that, when Uranus was going through the last degree of Aries this fall, there was a lot of difficulty. So there was a whole wave of public violence again, and so probably month of February will be very intense as the kind of fallout from the eclipses, as Uranus is finishing its last movement through the last degree of Aries before going into Taurus again in March. Okay, I've said enough. So thank you all for tuning in today. I hope that I didn't take notes today. As you can see the difference between when I take notes and when I don't. So this was a little bit more sprawling and rambling talk, so I apologize for that. I just wrote down which transits I wanted to talk about and then sat down and clicked play. Or clicked record. So thank you all for suffering through it, and I hope you have a beautiful week, and we'll be back together shortly. Take care. Bye.